Yo, brother, you're at home with a geek. I'm Mark, aka the Little Black Dude. Welcome back to my channel. Always good to have you back. If this is your first time here and you love TV shows, movies, video games, comic books, and other things of a geeky nature, mash the subscribe button and be sure to ring my bell to be part of the notification squad. That way you know whenever I have a new video coming out. I'm going to do another rant today, and it's going to be a little bit more along the lines of video games. I enjoy games like crazy. I am not a gamer, nor is this a gaming channel, but I do love talking about games because they were a big part of my childhood. A lot of what I spent my time doing was playing video games in the arcade. I absolutely loved going to the arcade at the Cumberland Mall in Vineland, New Jersey. Those of you who know where I'm talking about know what the deal was back then. Okay? That was one of the big haunts for those of us who grew up there in the 80s and 90s. Spent a lot of time in it between the time when it was Spaceport 2 as well as when it was Challenges, which when I was a kid didn't make sense, but now I understand, but still it's another story. I loved arcade games, but during the 80s, there was nothing more important to anybody than Nintendo. 1985, Nintendo revived the home gaming industry because it completely fell apart in 1983. There's plenty of information on the internet about the gaming crash in 1983. 1985 was when everything started coming back to life, basically. Well, when it comes down to it, the interesting bit of this is actually being paralleled now with the competition between the PlayStation and the Xbox, okay? But times are different now, okay? Not a lot of people have to choose between one system or the other or feel like they have to. When I was a kid, you always felt like you had to choose between systems because things were different. The economy was different, earnings were different. People felt differently about buying electronics just to buy electronics, okay? When you had a Nintendo in your house, it wasn't really a big deal. And you're like, oh, wow, you have a Nintendo. That's cool. But if you had a Nintendo and another console, holy crap, dude, you were amazing. It's like, wow, your family must be rich. Oh, wow, that's really cool. Because in 1985, Nintendo became the thing, and it just blew everybody's minds. Everyone that wanted one pretty much tried to get one. You know, it was a big deal to say, "Oh yeah, I got an NES, I got a Nintendo in my house." So that was the big thing. And then in the early 90s, Sega, who most people in America didn't really know was a big company, they debuted the Genesis. When the Genesis came out, it was a marvel, and it did everything it could to make the NES look as inferior as it possibly could. And it did a good job of it, right down to the marketing. I know a lot of the guys that are watching this, a lot of the people that are watching this are my age, so you guys remember Genesis does what Nintendo don't. They had commercials and newspaper ads and magazine ads that said that constantly, showed off all the games that were coming out, many of which were arcade games, which is another reason why this is such a big deal to me, because I played a lot of arcade games. For example, Altered Beast was one of my favorite arcade games when I was a kid. So when I saw that arcade games like Altered Beast were available on the Genesis, I wanted one. I wanted one badly when I was a kid. But at the time, having two consoles in your house was kind of a rich people thing. So it wasn't something that I was expecting to happen. Didn't really think much about it. 1991 was when the Super Nintendo came out here, and I couldn't contain myself because I was a Nintendo kid. Loved every bit of what Nintendo was putting out. So when the Super Nintendo came out and I played Super Mario World for the first time, oh, that was a whole nother world for me. So I wanted a Super Nintendo so badly. Loved every bit of it when I finally got one for Christmas in 1992. I did everything I could to make sure I got the best games for me. I worked like crazy in the house. I did extra chores. I did all kinds of, errands and stuff so that I could get games like Mega Man X. I loved that game. Used to rent video games from both West Coast Video and Blockbuster Video. Yes, I'm that old. I enjoyed playing video games a lot. So there were a lot of games that I really wanted to have. So I just, tried to do what I could with the Super Nintendo. About 2 years later, when the Genesis Model 2 came out, my older brother ended up getting that for his birthday. I remember this because we hid it from him in my room. That would hurt, but that's okay. But because my brother was older, it kind of made sense for him to get a Genesis. Now, the reason that that's interesting is because the Genesis was marketed towards older teenagers, whereas the Super Nintendo was marketed more towards kids. So it was a mindset difference when it came to the way that that game was, being marketed. I still find it interesting how much research went into marketing the Genesis because their whole thing was Nintendo tries to get them as kids. Let's see if we can get the older, teenagers to pay more attention to it. So everything that was done to be edgy and extreme, which was the way things were in the early to mid 90s. If something was edgy, if something was extreme, if something was out of the ordinary, it was gonna friggin' sell. And the Nintendo systems just didn't have that kind of image because of their marketing from the mid 80s. Now they were always pointing themselves at kids. Well, the Genesis made a point to point itself at other people. So this is really where I started to see older teenagers and adults playing video games more often. Additionally, because the Genesis was pointed more towards older kids, some of the games were a little bit more adult. And that also was part of the reason why the ESRB became a thing as well. You see, censorship on Nintendo consoles was draconian, to say the least. There were a lot of games that got altered, that had different things removed so that they were more palatable for all audiences, which is a good thing to do. Because if you want to sell to everybody, you need a game that appeals to everybody. Makes sense. But Sega was doing things a little differently, simply because they started pointing things more at older people. Games like Splatterhouse, games like Mortal Kombat, which was another arcade title that really kicked butt. I enjoyed the first three, and after Ultimate MK3 came out, I said, why are we still doing this? But that's another story. But a lot of the games were pointed more at mature gamers. Okay? When the Sega CD came out, that was the same kind of thing. Games like Sewer Shark and Night Trap were pointed more towards older gamers, even though those games sucked. But the fact of the matter still was, the console wars happened not because they were trying to take over what Nintendo was doing, but because they were trying to play to a different market, and because everyone was seeing it, it became a contender, essentially. So Sega versus Nintendo lasted up until the Sony PlayStation came out in, what was it, 1995, I think it was? And that whole thing changed the entire game. It cut into Nintendo's profits and daggone near killed Sega's consoles. But then Sega was its own worst enemy by the time the PlayStation had shown up, because the Saturn had been marketed so hard to try and be the PlayStation before the PlayStation, and was not capable of doing so. And the Dreamcast, which was a very good system, was poorly marketed and did not have the games that it deserved to have for the capabilities it had. This is evident by the fact that even though the Dreamcast did not sell as well as it could have, the homebrew community is so into Dreamcast homebrew games. I cannot get over how much stuff I've seen about homebrewers playing themselves to death on the Dreamcast, making new games for it, even today in 2017, where the PlayStation 4, the Xbox One S, and the Nintendo Switch are our standard systems. So the console war is something that is kind of a relic of the past, because back then we felt like we had to choose one system or another. And it's really not like that. And I'm glad that it isn't, but it does illustrate how much things have changed since then. I like the fact that I can have more than one system in my house and not feel bad about it. I mean, I personally have a PS3, I have a Wii, I have a PlayStation 2, and I have an old NES, which I am going to be fixing so that I can play some old retro games on it, because there's just something about playing Nintendo games on an NES. As much as emulators do the job, it doesn't feel as good. You know, if you're not holding that square controller, you gotta have it, man. But it makes a difference, if you ask me. If you think about the way that the systems were marketed, and if you think about the way things were during the early 90s, it does make sense that Nintendo and Sega were clashing like crazy. They were running each other over because they wanted that market share. They wanted people to buy their system and their games. Because at that time, when it came to video games, especially since the American market for video games was still coming back and it was still kind of shaky, everybody wanted to jump right in. Now, of course, let us not glance over the fact that there were other systems during that period of time, like the TurboGrafx 16, which I still think was a very smart system because they were using what were called Q cards, I think it was. It was either Q cards or B cards. I think it was one or the other, which made it capable of transferring games from the TurboGrafx 16 to its handheld, the Turbo Express, which I thought was so clever. But most people didn't even know about the TurboGrafx 16 nor the Turbo Express. The only reason I even knew either one of them existed was because I loved watching TV at the time, and the fact that I loved watching a show called Doogie Howser MD. Doogie Howser, Neil Patrick Harris, NPH for the win, by the way, had a Turbo Express, and I thought that that thing was freaking cool. So I went looking around in magazines and things like that to see if I could find it. And sure enough, when I found one, I saw it and I said, this is the coolest idea ever when I saw the game switching back and forth. But when it comes to the console war, everyone thinks Nintendo and Sega, because they were the two big players. They were the two people you were looking to beat. And unfortunately, there were a lot of consoles that came out that tried to compete and honestly couldn't roll because these were two really big players. They knew what their players wanted. Fast forward to 2017, we have the PlayStation 4, we have the Xbox One, and we have Nintendo Switch, all of which are systems that have their own appeal. But because of the way that the market is now, where exclusivity is no longer the big thing, as well as people having more than one system isn't such a big deal, it's really not that uncommon for a person to have all three systems. A good friend of mine collects, the new systems, and I remember going to his house and just sitting there a couple of years ago and just marveling at the fact that he had two shelves underneath his TV, one of which had a PlayStation 3, an Xbox 360, and a Wii, and the shelf above it had a Wii U, an Xbox One, and a PS4. That whole thing was the representation of what people want now versus what people could have back then. Gamers are different now than they have ever been. And 5 years from now, 10 years from now, they're going to be different again. So what's going to be the new thing? I don't know. All I know is that because the landscape is different now, I don't think there will ever be another true console war. Because no matter what system you're a fan of, I like PlayStation personally, I will never, ever want to own an Xbox. But I don't feel like I'm losing anything because all of the games that people would, tout for the Xbox, I can get on the PlayStation. And games that are exclusive to the Xbox, I personally can live without. But it's the same thing on the other side for some other people that really like the Xbox. Some people are like, I don't really care if I don't get a PlayStation because, the same games are available on both systems. And, there's certain games on the Xbox that you can't get for the PlayStation. It's not a big deal. But back in the day, when a game developer was only allowed to make games for one system due to contracts, due to the way that different developer contracts were designed, if you had a Genesis there were some games you weren't freaking playing unless you went over to your friend's house who had a Super Nintendo and vice versa. I loved Sonic the Hedgehog, but I was more a Nintendo kid. I loved playing the old Sonic games. When my brother had his Genesis, I used to play Sonic 3 all the time. I loved that frickin' game. Played Sonic 3 and Sonic and Knuckles, both of which were excellent games. But I was a Nintendo kid. I had to play my Mega Man games. I had to have Super Mario Brothers. I had to play RPGs, which there really weren't too many of on the Genesis. For example, one of the big ones was Phantasy Star, and I didn't know that until I was an adult. And I really do want to go back and try and check out some of the old Phantasy Star games. But it comes back to the mindset. When you have a system that has exclusive games, if those are the kind of games that you like, of course you're going to go in that direction. But now, game exclusives aren't really that big a deal. An exclusive game doesn't really mean that much anymore, because one or two exclusive games aren't going to be enough to sway somebody, first. And second, there are going to be people who don't give a crap about exclusive games because they have all the systems. So there will never be another console war. The closest thing we're going to get to that is the competition between the PlayStation VR and the Oculus Rift. And I still don't think that's even going to make a difference, because there are some people with some serious money that will buy both. But of course, my ranting does not make a difference to what your opinion might be. What is it that you think the console war really represented? What was it that made that fight between the Super Nintendo and the Genesis significant in gaming history? Do you think that there's a console war now? Do you think that one system is better than another? Leave your comments down low. Let's get a conversation going. But until next time, this is the Little Black Dude. Stay geek and proud. Yo, brothers. Thanks for checking out my video. If you want to see more, there's a couple ways you can do that. You can mash my AHG in the middle to be taken to my channel to check out some of my other videos. If you don't want to do that, there's a couple videos over there for your viewing pleasure. The one on top is my most recent video. The one down below is a video chosen just for you. Until next time, this is the Little Black Dude. Stay geek and proud.